The fires in the west wing of Callowbridge Hall had not been lit in 6 months, when Duke Edmund Vane finally stood in the doorway of what had once been his wife's private sitting room, and understood, with the sudden brutal clarity of a man waking from a long and comfortable dream, that he had been wrong about nearly everything that mattered. The dust on the writing desk had settled into a fine grey film, undisturbed by any hand. The chair by the window sat exactly where she had left it, angled toward the garden as though she might still be expected to return to it any moment and take up her needlework in the fading afternoon light. He had told his closest friend, not even a year before, that he had never needed her, that his household ran on his own competence and his own will, and that Isolde Vane had simply been a pleasant ornament upon it, easily replaced, easily forgotten. He had believed those words when he spoke them. Standing now in a house gone quiet and cold in her absence, surrounded by rooms that no longer seemed to breathe the way they once had, he understood that he had never been more wrong about anything in his life, and that the silence pressing in around him was not simply the absence of a wife, but the absence of everything that had once made Callowbridge feel like a home rather than merely a house. The question that would haunt him through the long months that followed was not whether he could win her back. The question was whether he even deserved the chance to try, and whether the damage his pride had done could ever truly be undone. To understand how a duke could stand alone in his own hall and feel, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely afraid of what he had built, one must return 3 years earlier to the autumn morning when Isolde Ferrers arrived at Callowbridge as a bride of 19, quiet and watchful, not carrying with her a modest dowry and a reputation for competence that had followed her from her father's smaller, well-run estate 2 counties to the north. Edmund had not married her for love. Not at first, though he would have denied even to himself that such a thing mattered a great deal to him in those early days. He had married her because his own mother, dying slowly of a wasting illness that had claimed the better part of 2 years, had made him promise to find a wife capable of managing the vast, sprawling responsibilities of Callowbridge with a steady hand, and Isolde, by every account that reached him, possessed exactly that steadiness. She was not the most celebrated beauty of that season's gathering of eligible young women, nor the wealthiest, nor the one whose family connections promised the greatest political advantage, but she was, according to everyone who had ever dealt with her father's household, extraordinarily capable, and capability, Edmund had decided, was worth considerably more to a man in his position than the fleeting satisfactions of passionate romance. Isolde herself had entered the marriage with no illusions about what was expected of her, having been raised by a practical father who valued usefulness over sentiment and who had taught her from a very young age that a woman's security in the world came not from being adored but from being indispensable. She arrived at Callowbridge prepared to make herself exactly that, and within the first year of her marriage she had transformed the estate's finances so thoroughly that Edmund's own steward, a man who had served the family for over 2 decades, privately confessed to visiting merchants that the young Duchess understood the estate's ledgers better than 3 generations of Vane men combined. She renegotiated contracts with the estate's tenant farmers that increased yields without increasing hardship. She identified and quietly dismissed 2 stewards who had been skimming profits for years without detection. And she managed the complex web of social obligations that came with Edmund's position with a diplomatic skill that spared him countless hours of tedious correspondence and awkward negotiation. Edmund noticed all of this, and he was in his own reserved way genuinely grateful for it, though gratitude, he would later come to understand, was not at all the same thing as love. And his failure to recognize the difference would prove to be the central tragedy of the years that followed. The trouble, when it began, did not announce itself with any dramatic confrontation or sudden betrayal, but rather crept into the marriage, slowly, the way rot creeps into old timber, invisible until the structure it supports begins to give way beneath the weight, was always meant to bear. Edmund had grown so accustomed to Isolde's quiet competence that he had stopped truly seeing her at all, treating her presence in his life the way a man treats the reliable turning of the seasons, an expected constant rather than a person whose efforts and sacrifices deserved acknowledgement. He praised his own stewardship of the estate at dinners with visiting lords, rarely mentioning the countless decisions Isolde had made that allowed his stewardship to appear so effortless. He accepted the smooth running of his household as simply the natural order of things, never once pausing to consider how many hours of careful management, how many difficult conversations with tenants and merchants and servants went into maintaining that smoothness. And Isolde, watching her own contributions steadily erased from the story her husband told about their shared life, began to feel herself disappearing inside a marriage that had never once asked what she actually wanted from it beyond her usefulness. It was during the 3rd year of their marriage that a man named Raphael Coste arrived at Callowbridge, ostensibly to negotiate a trade agreement on behalf of a coastal merchant house, though the true purpose of his visit would not become clear until much later, when the full shape of what he had actually come to disrupt finally revealed itself to everyone involved. Raphael was charming in a way that Edmund had never bothered to be, attentive to Isolde in conversations at dinner in a manner that noticed her opinions rather than simply her efficiency, and though nothing improper ever passed between them, his presence at Callowbridge over the following weeks did something that no amount of quiet resentment had yet managed to accomplish. It made Edmund, for the very first time in 3 years of marriage, actually look at his wife and wonder whether he had taken for granted something considerably more valuable than he had ever allowed himself to believe. He did not act on that flicker of uncertainty with any wisdom, however, choosing instead, in the peculiar and self-destructive way that pride often operates in men unaccustomed to examining their own failures, to double down on the very dismissiveness that had created the problem in the first place. When a visiting cousin, Lord Bertrand Ashworth, remarked one evening at dinner that Edmund seemed fortunate to have found a wife so capable of running his affairs, Edmund had laughed the observation away with a careless dismissal that would echo through Callowbridge's halls for months afterward, stating plainly, in Isolde's presence, that he had never actually needed her competence at all, that Callowbridge would run precisely as well under any sufficiently organized housekeeper, and that his wife's greatest value to him had always been simply the convenience of not having to think about such matters himself. He meant the words, in that moment, as a kind of careless bravado, a performance of masculine self-sufficiency. For an audience of male relatives he had always felt some obscure need to impress. He did not consider in the reckless carelessness of the moment that Isolde was sitting close enough to hear every syllable of it, her face carefully composed in the practiced stillness she had cultivated over 3 years of swallowing far smaller slights than this one. Isolde said nothing that evening, offering no visible reaction beyond the faint tightening around her eyes that only a servant who had spent years attending her private chambers might have noticed and correctly interpreted. But something inside her, some final reservoir of patience that had been slowly draining for 3 years without her husband's awareness, finally ran dry in that moment, and though Edmund would not understand the significance of what had just happened for weeks afterward, the truth was that his careless words at that dinner table had set in motion a chain of decisions that would, within half a year, leave Callowbridge Hall standing exactly as grand and imposing as it had always been, and entirely unbearably empty. The weeks following Lord Bertrand's visit passed with a surface calm that concealed, beneath it, a quiet and deliberate transformation taking place within Isolde herself. A transformation that Edmund, wrapped comfortably in his own unexamined assumptions, failed entirely to notice until it was far too late to intervene. She continued to manage the estate's affairs with her customary precision, continued to receive guests and organize household matters with the same competence that had defined her entire tenure as Duchess, but she began, in the private hours when Edmund assumed she was simply attending to routine correspondence, to methodically document every contribution she had made to Callowbridge's prosperity over the preceding 3 years, compiling ledgers and records that told a story her husband had never once bothered to read carefully. A story of tenant negotiations she had personally overseen, dishonest stewards she had identified and removed, diplomatic crises among visiting nobility that she had quietly diffused before they ever reached Edmund's awareness at all. She was not compiling this record out of any petty desire for vindication, though there was certainly some measure of that woven into her motivations. She was building, with the same careful thoroughness she brought to every task she undertook, a complete and honest accounting of exactly what her presence at Callabridge had actually meant. Because she had begun to suspect, in the quiet hours of reflection that followed Edmund's careless dismissal of her worth, that she needed this accounting not to prove anything to her husband, who had already shown himself remarkably unwilling to see her clearly, but to prove something to herself, to remind herself, in moments of doubt, exactly what she was capable of, and exactly what she deserved from any future she chose to build. It was during this same period that Raphael Coste, whose trade negotiations had stretched on far longer than the actual complexity of the agreement seemed to warrant, finally revealed to Isolde the true purpose behind his extended stay at Callabridge, a revelation that would complicate everything about the decision she had already begun quietly preparing to make. He confessed to her during a private conversation in the estate's walled garden on a mild evening, when Edmund had ridden out to inspect a distant boundary dispute, that he had come to Callabridge not merely as a merchant's representative, but as an emissary of sorts for his own family, minor but ambitious noble house from the coastal provinces. For years admired Isolde's reputation for financial acumen from a distance, and had sent Raphael specifically to determine, through careful and discreet observation, whether the rumors of her unhappiness in her current marriage held any truth, because his family, quite frankly, would consider it an extraordinary honor to offer her a position managing their own considerably larger estate and trading interests, entirely independent of any marriage, should she ever find herself free to accept such an offer. Isolde received this revelation with the same careful composure she brought to every surprising development in her life, though internally she felt something shift with the force of a door swinging open onto a room she had never before allowed herself to imagine entering. She had spent 3 years believing that her only path forward involved either enduring her marriage's quiet erasure of her worth or leaving it for an uncertain future, with no clear direction beyond the simple relief of escape. Raphael's proposal offered her something she had never considered a genuine possibility, an entirely different life, one where her competence would be valued explicitly rather than assumed and dismissed, one where her worth would never again depend on the goodwill or attention of a husband who had proven himself so thoroughly incapable of recognizing it. She told Raphael she needed time to consider the offer, and he assured her, with the same easy charm that had first caught Edmund's uneasy attention weeks earlier, that his family's offer would remain open for as long as she required. Though he gently noted that his own business at Callabridge could not be extended indefinitely without arousing exactly the kind of suspicion neither of them particularly wished to invite. Edmund, meanwhile, remained almost entirely oblivious to the depth of what was unfolding beneath the surface of his own household, his attention consumed by a boundary dispute with a neighboring landholder that had escalated, in recent weeks, into something considerably more serious than the usual minor disagreements over grazing rights that occasionally flared up between Callabridge and its neighbors. The dispute involved a stretch of contested farmland that had, according to old and somewhat ambiguous records, technically belonged to Callabridge for generations, but had been quietly cultivated by the neighboring Thornfield estate for so long that its current lord, a proud and stubborn man named Hollis Thornfield, considered the land as good as his own and had no intention of relinquishing it without a fight that could, if handled poorly, drag both estates into an expensive and reputation-damaging legal battle before the Crown's own courts. It was precisely the kind of complicated, high-stakes negotiation that Isolde had quietly handled on Edmund's behalf on more than one occasion throughout their marriage. her natural diplomatic skill and careful attention to legal precedent proving invaluable in situations where Edmund's more direct and occasionally impatient temperament tended to make matters worse rather than better. But Edmund, still smarting from his own careless words at that fateful dinner, and perhaps sensing on some level he refused to examine too closely that he had done something to strain his marriage in ways he did not yet fully understand, chose this particular crisis as the moment to prove to himself, as much as to anyone else, that he required no one's assistance in managing his own affairs. He rode out to confront Hollis Thornfield directly, without consulting Isolde on the historical records she had once painstakingly organized regarding exactly this stretch of contested land. And the confrontation that followed unfolded with all the predictable disaster that comes from a proud man attempting a delicate negotiation with nothing but his own stubbornness to guide him. The meeting ended not in compromise but in open hostility, with Hollis Thornfield storming away from the negotiating table, having accused Edmund of arrogance and bad faith, and threatening to bring the matter before the Crown's courts within the month, unless Callowbridge agreed to formally cede the disputed land entirely. To an outcome that would cost the estate not merely the farmland itself, but a considerable sum in lost revenue and, more damagingly, a significant blow to the Vane family's reputation among the county's other landholders, who would inevitably interpret any forced concession as a sign of Callowbridge's declining influence and Edmund's own diminished competence as its steward. Edmund returned to Callowbridge that evening in a foul temper, uncertain how to salvage a negotiation he had badly mishandled, and it was only then, faced with a crisis he genuinely did not know how to resolve alone, that he finally turned to Isolde for help. Walking into her sitting room with none of the careless dismissiveness of recent weeks, and asking her, with something bordering on genuine humility, whether she remembered the old land records regarding the Thornfield boundary, and whether she might have any insight into how the dispute could still be salvaged. Isolde looked at her husband for a long moment before answering, and in that silence something passed between them that neither would fully articulate until much later, a recognition on Edmund's part of exactly how much he had been relying on his wife's competence all along without ever acknowledging it, and a recognition of exactly how conditional her husband's respect for her actually was, offered freely only in moments of crisis when his own pride had already failed him, and withdrawn again, presumably, the moment the crisis passed. She helped him that evening, regardless, retrieving the old records from her own carefully organized files and walking him through the precise legal precedents that would allow Callowbridge to negotiate a far more favorable resolution than an outright forfeiture of the land. Precedents that Hollis Thornfield's own advisers had likely never bothered to research as thoroughly as she had. Edmund used her guidance the following week to negotiate a settlement that preserved most of Callowbridge's claim while offering Thornfield a face-saving concession on a smaller, less valuable parcel, a resolution that satisfied both parties and prevented the costly legal battle that had seemed all but inevitable only days before. He thanked her for her help that evening, genuinely and without the careless dismissiveness that had characterized his treatment of her contributions in recent months. And, for a brief moment, Isolde allowed herself to hope that perhaps this crisis had taught her husband something lasting about the value of what she brought to their marriage beyond simple convenience. That hope, however, would prove short-lived, because within a fortnight, Edmund's gratitude had already begun fading back into the comfortable, unexamined assumption that had defined so much of their marriage, and it was during a visit from his own father's old friend, a blustering nobleman named Sir Aldous Pembroke, who arrived at Callowbridge for an extended stay to discuss matters of mutual investment, that Edmund's careless dismissiveness resurfaced in a form even more damaging than before, setting into motion the final sequence of events that would determine, once and for all, whether Isolde Vane would remain the invisible architect of her husband's success, or finally claim for herself the recognition and respect she had spent 3 years quietly earning and just as quietly being denied. Sir Aldous Pembroke was precisely the kind of man who thrived in the company of other men, who shared his particular blend of bluster and unexamined entitlement, and his extended visit to Callowbridge brought with it a return of exactly the kind of masculine posturing that had proven so damaging at that earlier dinner with Lord Bertrand Ashworth. Over the course of several evenings spent drinking Edmund's finest wine and discussing investment opportunities in shipping ventures that Isolde had, anyone bothered to ask her opinion could have identified as considerably riskier than either man seemed to appreciate. "Sir?" With the casual cruelty of a man who had never once had to consider whether his words might wound someone he considered beneath his notice, to make pointed remarks about the supposedly diminished status of a duke whose household affairs were managed, in his words, by a wife, rather than by the duke's own capable hand. Edmund, emboldened by wine and by his own lingering insecurity about the boundary dispute he had so badly mishandled only weeks before, found himself once again falling into the same destructive pattern of performative self-sufficiency that had already cost him so much, insisting to Sir Aldous, in increasingly emphatic terms, as the evening wore on, that Isolde's role in Callowbridge's affairs had always been vastly overstated by servants and idle gossip, that he alone had built and maintained the estate's prosperity through his own judgment and effort, and that any suggestion otherwise represented precisely the kind of unfounded rumor that ambitious women and their sympathizers liked to spread in order to diminish the accomplishments of the men who actually deserved credit for them. He did not know, as he spoke these words with mounting and increasingly wine-fueled conviction, that Isolde herself had entered the hall's outer corridor moments before, intending to inform the two men that a light supper had been prepared, and that she now stood frozen just beyond the doorway, listening to her husband erase her entire contribution to their shared life, with a thoroughness that made his earlier careless remark to Lord Bertrand seem almost gentle by comparison. She did not confront him that night, retreating instead to her own chambers with a composure that cost her considerably more effort to maintain than anyone observing her calm exterior could have guessed. Was in the privacy of that room, surrounded by the carefully organized ledgers and records she had spent months compiling, that Isolde Vane finally made the decision that had been quietly building within her since the first careless dismissal so many weeks before. She would not confront Edmund with anger, would not demand an apology or an acknowledgement. She now understood he was fundamentally incapable of offering with any genuine sincerity, while his pride remained so thoroughly entangled with the performance of self-sufficient masculinity he seemed compelled to maintain in front of every visiting man of consequence. Instead, she would simply leave, quietly and without drama, taking with her only what genuinely belonged to her, and she would let the silence of Callowbridge Hall in her absence teach her husband exactly what 3 years of careless dismissal had actually cost him. She wrote to Raphael Costa the following morning, informing him that she had decided to accept his family's offer, and she began, over the following 2 weeks, the careful and deliberate process of preparing her departure, ensuring that every account was properly balanced. Every ongoing negotiation with tenants and merchants was documented clearly enough that whoever eventually took over her responsibilities would face no unnecessary confusion, and every detail of Callowbridge's operations was left in a state of order that reflected not spite, but simply the same thoroughness she had brought to every task throughout her marriage. She told no one of her plans, except Marguerite, a lady's maid who had served her faithfully since her arrival at Callowbridge, and whose discretion she trusted completely, and on a cold morning in early winter, while Edmund was away overseeing the final formalities of the Thornfield settlement. Isolde Vane departed Callowbridge Hall in a modest carriage, with only a handful of personal effects, leaving behind a single letter addressed to her husband, sealed, and placed upon his desk where he would be certain to find it upon his return. Edmund returned to Callowbridge that evening in reasonably good spirits. The Thornfield matter finally resolved to the satisfaction of both parties, and it was only when he entered his study and found the sealed letter waiting for him that his mood shifted with the sudden violence of a man realizing, too late, that he has misjudged something of profound importance. The letter itself was brief, composed with the same careful precision. Isolde brought to everything she wrote, informing him that she had accepted a position managing the estate and trading interests of a noble family in the coastal provinces, which she trusted he would find considerably more demanding without her assistance than he had apparently believed it to be in her presence, and that she considered their marriage, for all practical purposes, concluded, though she left the formal and legal dissolution of it to whatever arrangements he considered appropriate. Having no particular interest in prolonging a connection that had made itself so thoroughly clear, it did not value what she brought to it. Edmund read the letter 3 times before the full weight of its meaning finally settled over him, and it was only on the 3rd reading that he noticed, tucked beneath the letter itself, a small stack of neatly organized ledgers, the very same records Isolde had spent months compiling, documenting in exhaustive and undeniable detail every contribution she had made to Callowbridge's prosperity over the preceding 3 years. He sat alone in his study long into the night, working through page after page of evidence that painted a picture he had never once allowed himself to see clearly, a picture of a marriage in which his own success had depended far more substantially than his pride had ever permitted him to acknowledge on the quiet, unglamorous, and entirely unrewarded labor of a woman he had spent 3 years treating as an afterthought. The days that followed Isolde's departure brought Edmund face to face with exactly the kind of stark, practical reckoning that no amount of wounded pride could indefinitely postpone. Because a household as large and complex as Callowbridge did not simply continue running smoothly on the strength of a single man's authority. Regardless of how thoroughly that man had convinced himself and others of his own indispensable competence. Within the first week alone, 2 tenant disputes that Isolde would have resolved with a single carefully worded letter escalated into formal grievances requiring Edmund's direct and time-consuming personal attention. He found himself remarkably ill-equipped to provide, given how completely he had allowed his wife to shoulder this particular burden throughout their marriage. A steward whom Isolde had been quietly monitoring for irregularities in the estate's grain accounts, suspicions she had documented carefully in the very ledgers Edmund now possessed, but had not yet fully absorbed, took advantage of her absence to begin skimming profits with far less caution than he might otherwise have exercised. Confident that no one remained at Callowbridge sharp enough to notice, perhaps most painfully of all, the household staff themselves, many of whom had served under Isolde's careful management, long enough to have grown genuinely fond of her thoughtful and consistent leadership, began exhibiting a quiet but unmistakable demoralization in her absence, a household that had once run with the smooth, almost invisible efficiency of a well-oiled mechanism now creaking and stumbling through even routine daily operations, small errors accumulating into larger ones, as servants who had once known exactly what was expected of them found themselves uncertain about how matters ought to proceed without the steady guidance they had come to rely upon. Edmund noticed all of this with the mounting horror of a man watching a structure he had always assumed unshakable begin, slowly and then with gathering speed, to crumble around him. And it was during this period of accumulating small disasters that he finally understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late to spare him the pain of learning it this way, that his careless words to Sir Aldous Pembroke had not merely been an exaggeration born of wounded pride, but an active and profound lie, one that had cost him, in the end, considerably more than his marriage alone. He began, in the weeks that followed, a kind of desperate and increasingly humbling effort to reconstruct from Isolde's carefully organized ledgers and from his own belated and clumsy inquiries among the household staff, exactly how his wife had managed to make the impossible complexity of running Callowbridge appear so effortless. The process of this reconstruction proved humbling in ways he had not anticipated, because it revealed to him not merely the scope of her competence, but the sheer volume of small, thoughtful decisions she had made on his behalf, without ever once seeking credit or acknowledgement for them. Decisions about which tenant families needed a season's grace on their rents during a difficult harvest, decisions about which visiting nobility required careful diplomatic handling to avoid offense, decisions about which household expenses could be trimmed without anyone noticing the difference, and which could not be trimmed at all without real hardship to the people who depended on Calibridge's stability. It was Marguerite, Isolde's former lady's maid, who had remained at Calibridge after her mistress's departure, who finally gave voice to the observation that struck Edmund with the greatest force of all, remarking to him one evening, "With the particular bluntness servants sometimes permit themselves, once they have concluded a master has already fallen as far as pride can carry him, that the Duchess had never once, in 3 years of service, complained about the burden of her responsibilities. Not because the burden was light, but because she had genuinely believed, and in the early years of her marriage, that her effort was building something both of them valued together, and that it was only in these final months, watching her contributions dismissed with increasing carelessness before an audience of visiting men whose good opinion Edmund seemed to value more than his own wife's dignity, that she had finally allowed herself to stop believing that her effort was appreciated at all. Edmund absorbed this observation, the way a man absorbs a wound he has been too numb to feel until considerably after the blow that caused it, and it was in the days following this conversation with Marguerite that he began, for the first time in his adult life, to seriously consider the possibility that recovering what he had lost might require something considerably more difficult than a simple apology, something that would demand he fundamentally reconsider not merely his behavior toward Isolde specifically, but the entire architecture of assumptions about pride and self-sufficiency, relationships with everyone in his life, assumptions inherited. He began to realize from a father who had modeled exactly this same brittle, performative masculinity throughout Edmund's own childhood, and which Edmund had absorbed so thoroughly that he had never once thought to question whether they served him well at all. He wrote to Isolde within the month, a letter considerably longer and more difficult to compose than any correspondence he had attempted in years, in which he did not ask her to return, understanding on some level that such a request would be premature and, worse, would once again center his own desires rather than any genuine reckoning with what he had done. Instead, he attempted haltingly, and with none of his usual polished confidence, to articulate an honest accounting of exactly what he now understood about the 3 years of their marriage, acknowledging specifically the comments he had made to Lord Bertrand and to Sir Aldous, acknowledging that he had built his own public reputation for competent stewardship almost entirely on labour she had performed and he had claimed as his own, and acknowledging, in the letter's final and most difficult passage, that he did not yet know how to become the kind of man who deserved a partner as capable as she had proven herself to be, but that he intended to spend whatever time it required finding out, regardless of whether that effort ever earned him a second chance at the marriage he had so thoroughly failed to appreciate while he still possessed it. Isolde received this letter at her new position along the coast, where she had already begun demonstrating, within mere weeks of her arrival, exactly the kind of transformative competence that had made her invaluable at Calibridge, identifying and correcting inefficiencies in her new employer's trading operations, and earning, from her very first days in this new role, the explicit and vocal appreciation that had been so conspicuously absent throughout her marriage. She read Edmund's letter several times, much as he had once read her own departure letter, and found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, moved by its evident sincerity, even as she remained deeply uncertain about whether sincerity alone could undo 3 years of careful, cumulative erasure. She did not respond immediately, needing time to consider what, if anything, she genuinely wanted from a renewed connection with a man who had caused her such profound and prolonged pain. And it was during this period of careful reflection that Raphael Coste, whose own admiration for Isolde had grown considerably beyond the professional interest that had originally brought him to Calibridge, made clear to her, in a conversation conducted with considerably more directness than his earlier diplomatic overtures, that he would welcome the opportunity to offer her something Edmund apparently never had. A partnership built from its very foundation on mutual respect and explicit appreciation rather than assumption and quiet erosion. Isolde found herself genuinely torn by Raphael's proposal, recognizing in it the appeal of a future built without any of the painful history that colored every interaction she might yet have with Edmund, but recognizing too, with the same clear-eyed honesty she brought to every important decision in her life, that her feelings for Edmund, however damaged by his careless cruelty, had never actually disappeared, submerged though they had become beneath 3 years of accumulated hurt. She told Raphael with the same gentle but unmistakable directness she had once used to inform Edmund of her departure, that she valued his friendship and his professional confidence in her abilities considerably, but that she could not, in good conscience, build a new relationship with him while such significant unresolved feeling remained tangled up in her past marriage, and that she needed to resolve one way or another what she genuinely wanted regarding Edmund before she could honestly consider what she wanted with anyone else. She wrote back to Edmund several weeks later, a letter far shorter than his own but considerably more consequential, informing him that she was willing to meet with him once at a location of her choosing rather than at Calibridge itself, to hear whatever he wished to say to her directly, though she made clear, and in language that left no room for misunderstanding, that this meeting represented an opportunity for honest conversation rather than any guarantee of reconciliation, and that whatever decision she ultimately reached would depend entirely on what she observed in him during that conversation rather than on any promises made in advance of it. Edmund travelled to the coastal town where Isolde now resided with a nervousness he had rarely experienced in his adult life, having spent the intervening weeks attempting, with limited success, to actually implement the changes he had promised in his letter, rather than simply promising them, a process that had proven considerably more difficult than he anticipated, requiring him to sit through tedious meetings with tenants and stewards that he would once have delegated entirely to ask questions of household staff about matters he had never previously considered worth his direct attention, and to develop something approaching genuine competence in the vast web of responsibilities his wife had once shouldered so quietly that he had never appreciated their true weight. He arrived at the modest inn where Isolde had agreed to meet him, carrying not merely his own uncertain hopes for reconciliation, but a considerably more humble understanding of exactly what he was asking her to consider, giving him another chance to earn. The conversation that followed unfolded over the better part of an afternoon, conducted in the quiet corner of the inn's common room, with none of the grandeur or performance that had characterized so much of their marriage's public face, and Edmund found himself, for perhaps the first time since their wedding, speaking to his wife with none of the careless confidence that had once defined his every public utterance, offering instead a halting, genuinely uncertain account of everything he had come to understand since her departure, the specific ways he had taken her contributions for granted, the specific insecurities that had driven his need to perform self-sufficiency before other men, and the specific concrete changes he had already begun implementing at Calibridge in an effort to prove that his letter had represented genuine intention rather than empty apology. Isolde listened to all of this with the same careful attention she brought to every important decision in her life, asking pointed questions that revealed she had not simply accepted his account at face value, but was genuinely testing whether the changes he described reflected real transformation or merely a temporary performance of humility calculated to win her back before old patterns inevitably reasserted themselves. She asked him specifically how he intended to handle future situations in which other men like Sir Aldous Pembroke, made similar dismissive comments about a wife's role in managing household affairs, and Edmund's answer that he now understood such comments reflected the small, brittle insecurity of men who had never had to build anything of real substance themselves, and that he intended, going forward, to correct such comments directly, rather than compound them through his own cowardly silence or agreement, seemed to satisfy her more than any simple promise of changed behavior could have. She did not agree that afternoon to return to Callowbridge immediately, telling him instead that she required additional time to observe whether the changes he described would prove genuine and lasting, rather than a temporary adjustment born of immediate crisis. And she proposed, with the same practical clarity that had always characterized her approach to difficult problems, a period of careful correspondence and occasional supervised visits, during which they might rebuild, slowly and honestly, whatever trust his careless words had so thoroughly damaged, before either of them committed to any permanent decision about their shared future. Edmund agreed readily to these terms, understanding, with a humility that would have been unimaginable to the man he had been only months before, that he had forfeited any right to expect swift or easy forgiveness, and that whatever future he might yet build with Isolde would need to be earned through consistent demonstrated change rather than through any grand romantic gesture that might once again center his own desires over her genuine well-being. The months that followed brought a slow, careful rebuilding of trust between them, conducted largely through letters at first, letters in which Edmund found himself for the first time in his life, genuinely articulating his own uncertainties and struggles rather than performing a confidence he did not actually feel, and in which Isolde gradually and cautiously began allowing herself to share more of her own thoughts and feelings than the careful, guarded competence she had maintained throughout their marriage had ever previously permitted. She visited Callowbridge twice during this period, brief visits during which she observed, with the same clear-eyed attention, she brought to everything the tangible evidence of Edmund's changed behavior, the way he now consulted household staff and tenants directly rather than dismissing their concerns, the way he had begun keeping his own careful records of estate matters rather than relying entirely on others to manage what he considered beneath his direct attention, and, perhaps most tellingly of all, the way he spoke of her own past contributions to Callowbridge's prosperity openly and without hesitation. On one occasion she witnessed directly a careless comment from a visiting lord with a directness and conviction that would have been unthinkable in the man she had left behind only months before. It was during her second visit, held in early spring, as the first genuine warmth of the season finally began softening the harsh edges of winter that had defined so much of their separation, that Isolde finally allowed herself to consider seriously what a genuine return to Callowbridge might actually mean. Not a return to the marriage that had existed before, built on assumption and quiet erasure, but the possibility of building something entirely new upon the same foundation of shared history, a marriage in which her competence would be explicitly valued rather than silently assumed, and in which her voice would carry equal weight in decisions that affected them both, and in which the hard-won lessons of their painful separation might yet serve as the bedrock for something considerably more honest and sustainable than what they had built in their first 3 years together. She told Edmund, during a quiet walk through the same walled garden where Raphael Coste had once made his own offer to her, that she was willing to return to Callowbridge, not as the invisible architect of her husband's success as she had once been, but as an equal partner whose contributions would be acknowledged openly and whose voice would carry genuine weight in every decision that shaped their shared future. And Edmund, standing beside her in the same garden where he had once so carelessly dismissed her worth to a man he barely respected, told her, with a sincerity that finally matched the depth of his understanding, that he wanted nothing less than exactly that kind of partnership, and that he understood, now with a clarity that had cost him nearly everything to achieve, that a house built on one person's quiet, unacknowledged labor was never truly a home at all, merely an elaborate performance of one, and that the emptiness he had felt standing alone in Callowbridge's silent halls had taught him more thoroughly than any words ever could exactly how much he had needed her all along. Earl returned to Callowbridge that spring, and the marriage they rebuilt in the years that followed bore only a passing resemblance to the one that had nearly collapsed entirely beneath the weight of Edmund's careless pride, because this time The household ran not on the silent, unacknowledged labor of a woman erased from her own story, but on the genuine partnership of two people who had each, in their own painful way, learned exactly what they stood to lose through carelessness and exactly what they stood to gain through honest acknowledgement of what the other actually contributed. The story of Calabridge's empty halls and the Duke who learned far too late for comfort, but not too late for redemption, exactly how much he had needed the wife he once dismissed, would be told throughout the county for years afterward, not as a simple tale of romantic reconciliation, but as a quieter and more enduring lesson about the particular cruelty of taking for granted the very people whose steady, unglamorous labor makes everything else possible, and about the considerable courage it takes for anyone to finally see clearly what pride had spent years working so hard to obscure.